In this lecture, we are going to begin setting up things for how we are going to handle exception in the application that we are developing. I mentioned previously that things related to exceptions will be stored inside of the exception folder, which we have under the SRC folder. Exceptions are basically things that we don't really expect to happen, unexpected things, things that are out of the normal, taking place when our script run. For example, passing wrong credentials to the database, which will essentially lead to our application not functioning the way that we want it to function. So this kind of situations, we want to be able to handle them in a very different way. So the first thing I want to do here inside of the exception folder is to create a new class. So this is basically going to be an abstract class. So we're going to just call this base exception. And this is going to be under the namespace app exception. And then right here, I'm going to add the keyword abstract. So this is basically an abstract class. And essentially what this means is that we cannot create a new instance of this class. So I cannot come here now and say new base exception. So if we do this, we're going to actually get an error because this is an abstract class. It cannot be instantiated. All right, so what we want to do here is to ensure that this class is actually extending the base PHP exception. So we're going to say this should extend the PHP exception class. So let's just take this and add a use statement here. So we'll say use exception. And then I could actually remove this. So inside of this class, we're going to have a protected property called data. And the reason why we want to have this property is so that we can actually pass in more information to the exceptions. So information that will be useful for us to actually debug, we can pass it through to the exception classes that we'll be creating. So this is going to actually be an optional parameter. And then we are going to override the constructor of the exception class that we're actually extending. So we want to override that constructor. We create a public function construct, and you can see here, because I'm using a smart test editor, it's actually put in the right parameters that we actually need to pass into the parent constructor. So the things that we need to pass through are message, code, and previous. And you can see from the arguments here that we have message, the code, and previous, which is a throwable. So what I want to do is to actually add one more. So let's add one here, which is going to be array, and that should be data. And we're going to set it to be equal to an empty array initially. And then before we call the parent constructor, we're going to say this data should be equal to data. So I'm just going to move all this to a new line. So we have done with the constructor, and you take note here that we are actually not passing this through to the parent constructor because it doesn't know how to deal with this data. This is only going to be available in our own base exception class. So we probably want to add one or two methods to be able to set the data dynamically. So I'm going to add two more methods. So public function set data. And this is going to take essentially two arguments. So string, the key, and then the value. So the value could be an array, or it could be integer or a string. So we're not going to actually declare a type there. So this method is going to return void. And then we're just going to say this data, and then pass it a key, which is the key that was provided, and then it should be equal to whatever value was actually provided. And then we're going to have one more, which will allow us to actually get the data if for any reason we actually want to get it. So public function get data. So essentially this is actually extra data. So extra data that we want to make available. So let's just add this method, and this is going to return an array, and we can say return. So what we can actually do here is prepare this data in such a way that if we have a nested array, they will be displayed properly. So we can do that by using JSON decode. So we can say JSON decode, and then we can also pass it now JSON encode. So that will be this data, and then we can set this to true, so it returns as an array. So this way, if we have multi-level array, the nesting will be actually displayed properly. If in any case we want to pass this to our logger or anything, so the information will be displayed properly. And then we want to do one more check. So we're going to say if the count, so if the count of this data is equal to 0, which means the data is not available. So we want to just return this data, which is an empty array. So that's basically all that we need to do for the base exception class. The next thing that we want to do now is to create one exception class that is going to actually extend this base exception class. So we're going to call this not found exception. So let's call this not found exception. So we're going to throw this exception if a given resources that the user is looking for was not being located in the application. So this is like in a case of a 404 or something. So not found exception, we're looking for the user specified a file name that is not existing. We're going to throw this exception. So let's create this, and then let's make it extend base exception. Okay, so that's all we need to do for this specific class. And now we can come again to app, I think app or config, where we're actually throwing an exception. Okay, so right here we're throwing a runtime exception when the file was not found. So what we can now do here is to actually throw this not found exception. So I'm going to come here and just replace these two not found exception. And we now also have the ability to pass in more data. So we can actually put a command here and then pass in an array of data if we have more information or more data that we want to pass through to the user for debug purposes. Okay, so we're not going to pass in any data here. We want to create one more exception class, or actually two more. So this one is going to be missing argument. So if a specific function or a class or anything requires an argument, if that argument is not provided, we are actually going to throw this exception. So that will be missing argument exception. And it's also just going to extend base exception. So extend base exception. And then we're going to add another one. And then this is going to be database connection exception. So this will be used when we attempt to connect to the database and then there was a problem. We are going to throw this exception. So the beauty of this is the ability for us to actually customize this exception the way that we want. And now we are done with the first part. So we now have a way within our application to actually handle exceptions properly. Not handling exception per se, but we have a way now to create our own custom exception, and we can actually define a message.